Hello, friends. I got up today, the 4th of July, the so-called 250th birthday celebration of the United States, which is where I was born and where I live. I had no sense that today I would make any kind of message about this 250 years. But one thing has led to another today and yesterday and at other times. Yesterday I listened to a beautiful discussion about slavery in the United States, and the courage of people to rise above enslavement. Some years ago, I read deeply about the Iroquois Confederacy. That's long before Europeans had come to the United States, had worked out a representational government with a social contract in the sense of individual freedoms. They had a declaration of their version of declaration of not independence, because they weren't trying to be independent of an oppressor. It was a declaration of human rights. It was oral. It was an oral tradition. And one of the great philosophers born in the 1600s who influenced the French in the 1700s and traveled to France, a man named Condillac, fascinated me that he was such a clear mind, such an eloquent speaker, and that he profoundly critiqued French society, and his critique of French society became the basis of the so-called Enlightenment. And philosophers like Rousseau and Voltaire were profoundly influenced by this indigenous man. So the reason I say all these things is because, for me, being patriotic and celebrating 250 years of this country is not about the wars we fought, the wars we shouldn't have fought, the ones that I believe we had to fight against fascist Germany. And I'm not a critique. I'm not going to make a critique of our society. I'm going to say that I'm a patriot, not of the United States, but of the deepest values that were never original to the United States, not original to our founding fathers, but have been part of our human heritage, our slow, progressive quest toward democratic ideals, toward natural rights for human beings, toward love one another. And for that, this country is a step in the history of that. Many of you will have at some point studied early, Athens at its peak, and the philosophers there, the discussions between Socrates and Plato and his students and the Socratic method, and the philosophers like Aristotle, and the great thinkers, the great spiritual teachers who shake things up like Buddha and Jesus, and who and more contemporary, Martin Luther King Jr., and the civil rights movement. And we finally, the United States, ended slavery technically. Lincoln, in his Emancipation Proclamation, freed the slaves in 1865 or around there. But the very country we fought against, Great Britain, England, to gain our independence that we celebrate today, that country ended all slave trade in its empire in 1807, almost 60 years earlier. And 20 years after that, or 24 years after that, in the 1830s, it freed all slaves within its empire. And it did that without a horrible, bloody revolution. Now, I'm not saying it was smooth in any particular instance, because the economic forces for slavery were always always corrupt even the best ideals. Um, what I am trying to say is, well before Europeans got here, human beings in this country, indigenous peoples, had forms of confederation, forms of self-governance, forms of representational governance that included women and a sense of social contract. And they were deep enough thinkers to influence what we so proudly call the Enlightenment period um, in Europe. So I am a patriot, but I'm a patriot, and I call you to it too. I'm a patriot for those values and that resurgent call to love one another, the resurgent call to find a way, a dialectic, a communication, a way of communicating to work out better and better forms of self-governance. Now, it's never been easy, but Athens was a small society, and eventually it was invaded by Sparta and it collapsed. But almost all forms of this bursting forth of an enlightened philosophy, an enlightened way of organizing social contracts and laws, it always, in the end, goes backwards. It always is collapsed or crushed, often by economic forces, because economic forces play into the greed and fear that most human beings don't know how to find a moral ground to navigate through. And that's also what happened to the Iroquois. That's what happened to the Iroquois Confederacy and all the indigenous peoples in the United States. It didn't matter that there was a peace that was created between that group of indigenous people and France. Eventually, the traders, the traders in animal skins, the commercial interests, the dogmatic religious influence of Christianity and Catholicism as it poured into North America, it destroyed them. They ended up being crushed. And always with the dialogue, but always with the narrative that they're somehow inferior, that they're not of the caliber of whoever is the dominant group at the time. And just listen to our current president talking about this country in the way he does. It's the dominant, the most powerful, the greatest ever. And yet his very values are the kinds of values that take the experiment of democratic representational social contract governance. Social contract means things like every human being has food, every human being has medical care, no one is left behind completely in poverty. And we are, as a species, evolving slowly, steadily. What we do much, much faster is the creation of knowledge that gives us enormous power to manipulate the environment, enormous technological reach that allows us to extend our senses into the cosmos, into the universe. Space telescopes, for example, the incredible giant telescope now in Chile that's just gone online that is looking to demonstrate the existence of dark matter. Why is it that our galaxy is rotating, and many of the galaxies are rotating? They should be rotating at a speed that throws them apart, like you swinging a bucket on a rope, and then the rope breaks and the bucket goes flying. But it doesn't happen because there's this invisible, never discovered, but presumed existence of dark matter. We do that. We extend our senses that way. But we don't know how to, in our manipulation and modification and extension of technologies, we don't know how to actually govern ourselves very effectively. And so these bursts of enlightenment in Athens, in the indigenous peoples of this country, probably through the 14, 15, 1600s, I mean, indigenous people fought, indigenous people went to war, but it's always a non-productive process. Eventually, cooperation, collaboration, working together, peaceful coexistence, celebratory coexistence, is a much more sane and virtuous and healthy if you're going to live your life, why would you be unhealthy in social contracts that make people miserable? But slavery is supposedly now banished in our world, but there are different forms of slavery, forcing people to work 2 jobs and 3 jobs, and while other people accumulate billions and trillions of dollars. That kind of imbalance, it's so difficult for us to reckon with. So today, 250th anniversary, I am a patriot for the values that did not come from our founding fathers, that came as well from Europeans who were educated by indigenous people like the orator war chief Kandiarong, that came from philosophical treatises from ancient Greece that they read. Our founding fathers were the product of other founding fathers and mothers, back across millennia. So if this is a birthday party, a celebration of 250 years of this particular experiment in self-governance, with no guarantee, like with Athens, like with the Iroquois Confederacy, there's no guarantee this is going to succeed, that it's going to have a 300th birthday or a 500th birthday. Not at the speed with which technology is advancing, faster than we can use it to clean up the mess technology is making, which is really, just in one case, let's call it the plastics. You do an autopsy of a human brain now and you find the equivalent of 1 disposable plastic spoon of plastic in a brain. And the more plastic, the more strokes, the more plastic, the more heart attacks. And we don't see how to govern that, because that's about capitalism. That's about money. That's about profit. That's about progress, as ceaseless growth of economies and progress. And that doesn't know how to mesh itself effectively with the moral virtues that are there in what we call, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Straight out of Kandiarong's mouth, 100 years before, or 90 years before the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. So don't worry that we seem to be going backwards. Trump, his administration, their values, opposing birthright citizenship, opposing immigration, setting boundaries, that kind of populism, that kind of fear of the other, that's been around forever. That's been around forever. But I would, if you were an American or a European, don't worry whether the United States will be, if you're a European, an adequate ally in the case of war with Russia in terms of the structure of NATO. It might not be. Our lives are brief. Our lives are short. A generation is nothing. 3 generations is next to nothing. The United States might collapse. The European experiment of governance, of trying to weave different countries together, it might collapse. China's might be the next best idea for lifting people out of poverty, but at the oppression of rights. The problem will keep playing out. And if we don't destroy ourselves due to the success of our own technologies, we have the ability to solve all the problems of energy and pollution. We don't have the economic motive. And without the economic motive, we'll never have the political will, because politics and money are so woven together, because every human being is so undeveloped in terms of being able to set aside our own individual self-interest. And we're all afraid of not having enough, afraid of uncertainty. Have more money. I can control everything that will happen to me in the future. And you can control a lot. But you can't necessarily build a world that works for everyone, or a little better for everyone. Yet that impulse is more fundamental to us than the impulse toward individualistic, selfish behavior, philosophies, justifications, narratives narratives that turned Jews into subspecies for the Nazis, narratives that turned Africans into an inferior race that could be distributed around as forced labor in this country, the United States. We're moving, so be a patriot for those values. And in your view of what seems to oppose those values, there has to be a witnessing capacity that understands that this is a movement. But the impulse of love, the impulse of the coherence of love that we can trace back historically, I did Greece, I did the Iroquois Confederacy and so forth. England, Great Britain, freeing slaves ahead of us, and so forth. It will continue. It can't be suppressed. Even if Elon Musk's idea is we have to get human consciousness on Mars, build because we might lose consciousness on Earth. We could. It's an actual fact that you and I are more likely to die from an asteroid impact on planet Earth than any one of us is likely to die from an airplane crash. So that's a not insignificant likelihood. Our technology, our science, our knowledge may make it possible for us, probably can make it possible for us to protect ourselves from that, but not necessarily. And then if the Earth's destroyed, but consciousness is alive on Mars, it can come back and re-inhabit the Earth in some way. Maybe. So maybe he's not as crazy as he seems if you take this broad picture of a universe that is not kind, where planets are destroyed and sucked into black holes and pulsars cook half galaxies in one burst of energy. I mean, we don't live in a safe place. And we can't be lazy about creating safety. And we don't know how to do it for anyone else but ourselves. How can you be safe? You don't let your mind close your heart. And you wouldn't, I'm not sure what situation would be the situation where I might take up arms to defend a principle. I don't think I would. But I do know that I would never stop short of anything that my mind can do, that I can witness. If what my mind is doing creates division, separation, is a narrative that diminishes other people or another person, if my mind is doing that, I'm grateful to see it, and I don't believe it's true, ever. And that's a power we have. That's a radical thing that we can do. Basically say, love wins. I never win if I can contradict what love might want. And that's your idea. You have to decide, what is love? Is it just what you feel for your children or your grandchildren, or for your spouse, or for a sibling that you're close to, or for a spiritual teacher? Or is love something even more? Is it not maybe the very background of the universe? That evolution, the evolution of consciousness, is moving towards something that love wants, and that's the story of Athens at its greatness. That's the story of the effort of the Iroquois Confederacy and other kinds of indigenous confederacies that were far more advanced in some ways than our current democracy. But of course, they were very small groups of people. So it's a little exponentially easier to do when there's so much diversity, people coming from so many different cultures, so many different languages. And what we're trying to weave together is nothing short of remarkable. And if we're afraid of the weaving, okay. If we believe in the weaving, okay. Happy 250th birthday, United States of America. But do not think of patriotism as identification and allegiance with a nation state. Think of patriotism as your commitment to help that nation state start to express the coherence of love in its cultural and social construction. Each of us can do very little. A vote matters, but matters very little. But each of us has relationships every day that matter a great deal. And those relationships can have the deepest principles of natural rights, of love one another, of social contract, inherent in every conversation, inherent in every transaction. That's a prayer. But I don't think you have to pray for the impulse that toward that kind of self-governance, toward that kind of communion of human beings together on this planet and maybe beyond it. I think that that's built in to whatever it is that's evolving consciousness. It's not just a creation of our minds that we adhere to. It's an impulse from something deep and profound. Then we find the words. Then we try to find the narratives, the ideologies, the values, the moral constructions, the social contracts. So today's 250th birthday is thousands of years in the making. And every time that experiment has come forward on the earth so far, it has then been crushed and gone backwards. And then it returns. Then it sprouts again. I don't think that's ever going to stop. And in that sense, I'm a profound optimist. I'll stop here.